Okay, so in this video we're going to start section 3 of the chapter, and your heading for this is Changing Outlooks in European Society. So I'll give you a minute to write that down. It's Changing Outlooks in European Society. So we're going to look at how people's worldviews, or the way they look at life, the afterlife, issues of Christianity versus secularism. This is going to start changing, partially as a result of the Industrial Revolution, but more so resulting from a kind of scientific revolution, if you will. So we're going to have our first subheading of Faith in Scientific Progress. Faith in Scientific Progress. So basically, as science and technology start progressing very quickly, we start seeing inventions like the telegraph, the telephone, we start seeing aviation technology, automobile technology arriving on the scene, locomotion, steamboats. As science progresses, people really start putting their hope in science as opposed to in Christianity and faith in God. So they don't put their faith in God himself, they put their faith in what science can do for them, what technological advancement can do for them. One of the ways this becomes most apparent is through the evolutionary outlook. So if you want to put a subheading of evolutionary outlook, that would be good. So before we get to the Industrial Revolution, we had the Age of Reason, where intellectually, not scientifically, but intellectually, people began to distance themselves from Christianity, from faith. Now we're seeing it more scientifically. But before that, even if we take a step further back in time, a lot of early scientists were Christians. So a lot of early scientists would be trying to discover what God had done in nature, as opposed to now that we're getting in the Industrial Revolution timeline, a lot of scientists are trying to look at what nature has done in nature. One of the people most responsible for this is Charles Darwin. Charles Darwin is a very controversial figure. He writes a book called The Origin of Species. It's actually, you just need to know the origin of species. It's actually On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection. But that's a pretty wordy title, so most people shorten it to Origin of Species. He writes this book in 1859. And the premise of his book is that species, like different species, have originated from one parent species. So he actually makes a kind of family tree of the animal kingdom, and he argues that everything started from, for example, all the different pigeons, they started from one pigeon. But that pigeon started from something else, which started from something else. Now, he doesn't really make the claim of what those things are necessarily. He just gives examples of why he believes that is the case. So this really, this shakes people up a little bit. Now, the idea of survival of the fittest or natural selection, that is one of his theories as well. But a lot of people lump natural selection together with evolution. Natural selection doesn't have to be mutually linked together. It's not mutually exclusive with evolution. Natural selection is just a phenomenon that happens, that things that are healthier tend to survive longer. That doesn't mean that evolution is true. But anyway, people began to get upset about these ideas, particularly conservative Christians. However, there were other people that wanted to embrace these ideas because it gave them an excuse to not find themselves accountable to God. Now, just because they don't think they're accountable to God because they're following this belief of evolution doesn't mean that that's true. So anyway, he writes another book in 1871, and this is called The Descent of Man. Now, a lot of people think Darwin makes the argument that man evolved from primates in The Origin of Species. He doesn't. He makes that case in The Descent of Man, which is the second book. So in The Descent of Man in 1871, Charles Darwin makes the argument that man has descended, or ascended rather, in the evolutionary framework up from primates. So this really gets a lot of people fired up in the Christian community, and in society in general. A lot of conservative people don't like this idea because it takes away a lot of moral responsibility that we have, and it takes away the idea that we're made in the image of God. So a lot of the things that men do, like mankind does, that is wrong, we can just blame it on, if we follow this, we can just blame it on the fact that, oh, it's just my instinct, I'm descended, or I've ascended from monkeys, so, of course I'm going to have some natural instinct that makes me do these bad things. So it takes away the accountability that we have to God. Okay, so we're going to be talking about the revolution in the physical sciences, which is your next subheading, revolution in the physical sciences. And there are several people that your book is going to cover that made discoveries in the physical sciences that were the building blocks for further discoveries that are going to be made in the future. It tends to be that way in science, where one person makes a minor discovery, another person makes another minor discovery on top of that, who makes another minor discovery built on top of that. So the time frame here is from the 1800s to the early 1900s. So your timeline is 1800s to early 1900s. And we'll be covering several important discoveries that were made. The first person that's mentioned under the subheading of revolution in the physical sciences is John Dalton. John Dalton came up with the theory that everything is composed of atoms. So all chemical elements are composed of little tiny atoms. Now, this isn't a new theory. The ancient Greeks had a theory called atom theory. Now, they didn't have the exact idea that elements are made up of atoms. But they had the idea that everything is made up of tiny little indivisible parts called atoms. And John Dalton just used this theory and said that elements are made up of atoms. Now, we know that atoms are divisible now since we have atomic theory. We've successfully divided the atom, and we've also successfully fused atoms together. So John Dalton, his atom theory is the foundation for a lot of atomic theory that is built on it later. Another important person, whose name you probably know from your science classes, is the gentleman who is responsible for making the periodic table. So he takes the idea that elements are made up of atoms, and he organizes these elements according to their atomic masses. And the gentleman who's responsible for this is Dmitri Mendeleev. And I'll spell that for you. It's D-M-I-T-R-I, Dmitri, M-E-N-D-E-L-E-E-V, Mendeleev. And he's responsible for making the periodic table. Other things that were discovered, the X-ray was discovered during this time period. You don't need to know the particular person who's responsible for discovering it. But X-rays were discovered. Pierre and Marie Curie, C-U-R-I-E, they discovered radioactivity. I mean, it obviously existed, but they're the first people to identify it for what it was. So sadly, though, Marie Curie died from cancer from exposure to radioactive elements. But it was her and her husband's life work to study radioactivity. Probably the most notable and most recognizable person that made scientific advancements during this time period is Albert Einstein. When I say Marie Curie, many of you probably don't have an image in your mind of what Marie Curie looks like. Or if I say Dmitri Mendeleev or John Dalton, or Henry Moseley or someone like that. Many of you probably don't know who that is, but most, if not all of you, if I say Albert Einstein, probably know who he is and can call up a picture in your mind of who he is. Albert Einstein came up with a couple of revolutionary theories in the scientific world. He came up with the theory of relativity. There are two theories of relativity, actually, but we'll just lump them together as they usually are. He came up with the theory of relativity, and he showed the relation between energy and mass. So energy equals mass times the speed of light squared, or E equals mc squared. And he basically shows that energy and mass are interchangeable, which people just couldn't grasp before he came along. And what's interesting about him is he wasn't a professional scientist when he first got involved in science. He was a patent clerk. He worked at a patent office, and he came up with relativity. But Albert Einstein's theory of relativity became the basis for the classical model of physics, which you may or may not have learned yet. But it was foundational for further scientific progress. Something else that we need to talk about is the impact of science on society. Once science started progressing, particularly from Charles Darwin onward, we see the secularization of society to the point where science almost became a religion itself. People will argue that science isn't a religion, or atheism associated with science, or materialism. They're not religions. However, when posed with problems of certain theories, they'll make the statement that we just need to wait for science to show the answers later. Well, it's faith, isn't it? Right? If you don't have all the answers and you're waiting for the answers to come later, that's faith. So it's almost as if science became some sort of faith where people trusted in science enough that they didn't have to have all the answers. Now, isn't that what we do when we don't have all the answers? As Christians, we trust in God. And we trust in His character. I'm not saying they're the same thing. I'm saying there are similarities in the fact that they're faith. Now, obviously, I think trusting in God and His character is much different than trusting in science, much different than that. But I'm saying that during this time period, people were just saying, well, we'll trust in science. We'll put our hope and faith and trust in science that it will save us, or it will provide us with the answers we need. And this starts with Darwin and progresses through the period of the Industrial Revolution.